Hello, and welcome to another episode of the World Discord podcast. I am Joel Ostro.
And I'm Brian Endless. How you doing, Joel?
Right. How are you doing today, Brian?
Just fine as I reposition my microphone very unprofessionally after we started.
Well, no one ever accused us of being professional.
That's true.
Um, so I will let Brian introduce our guest in a moment. We will be talking today about Rwanda. We have touched on Rwanda sort of indirectly in a prior episode when we talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo. Um, and actually, I think it was last week, or was it still this week, when French President Macron sort of publicly put some kind of pressure on Rwanda to remove its troops from Democratic Republic of Congo. Um,
They go back and forth all the time. We'll talk about that
yeah,
later.
yeah. In the context of a number of other statements that President Macron made, but we won't talk about those today. Um, just as a really general background, I'm going to keep it short because both Brian and our guest are expert on Rwanda, and I am not. Um, but it's 2024, so a little over 30 years ago, Rwanda experienced the um, torturous genocide um, that resulted in the deaths of around 1 million people in roughly 90 days. But Rwanda has sadly not been without conflict really since then. Um, President Kagame still, who led the Rwandan Patriotic Front that put an end to that round of violence, has held power, dictatorial power, for the last 30 some years. Um, and Rwanda has continued to be host to internal problems and problems for really all of its neighbors, one way or another. Um, and for reasons that maybe initially made sense, but over time have become less rational in some ways, perhaps, or harder to explain. Rwanda has remained in political favor, at least with much of what we would know is the democratic West, the United States, North America, European Union states have continued to do business with Rwanda and in many cases speak highly of its leader and its politics. And maybe that's started to change a couple of years ago with the kidnapping and holding of Paul Rusesabagina for almost 2 years, I think it was. As
Over two
really a
years, two
over
years,
two
9 months. Yeah.
as a political prisoner. Rusesabagina, of course, the hero who inspired the movie Hotel Rwanda, rescued over 1,000 people in the hotel that he managed during the genocide. And I think that did cause at least some people to reevaluate the Kagame regime and to look again at what Rwanda is, in fact, although really insufficient or even non existent change in that regard. So, with that, I will turn things over to Brian to introduce our guest and to kick off our episode.
Thanks, Joel. I want to welcome our guest today, Claude Gatabuke. Claude has been a friend for many years, and we've worked together in his position as the founder and executive director of the African Great Lakes Action Network. A little bit on his history. Claude is a Rwandan genocide survivor. He fled that country as a preteen refugee and settled in the United States. He is one of the vast majority of genocide survivors who, for a long time, was reluctant or unwilling to speak about his experiences. But in his early adulthood, he realized the world needed to hear his and other stories. His experience both living through the violence of the genocide and his life as a refugee and forced migrant led him into his work, where he does great work today in the field of international human rights. I want to particularly point out, not to sell your book, but people should certainly go out and look for the book. But he has a fantastic book that came out last year that he is a co-author and organizer called Survivors Uncensored. And it's one of the first books on Rwanda that features the personal accounts of over 100 genocide and civil war survivors. And these stories are told by the refugees and survivors themselves. Many of them were unwilling or afraid to speak until this time. Claude advocates for the human rights of both refugees and those still in Rwanda and other countries in the region. And I want to welcome him. Claude, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Joel. I'm
Thank
looking
you.
forward to this conversation, and I appreciate the big shout out, Brian, to the book, and big
Yeah,
shout out to.
we'll have to hold up a book in the background or something. I'll get a picture for us.
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to start off with a question. Joel mentioned it's been 30 years since the horrific genocide in 1994. We certainly don't need to tell you that. Can you tell us just briefly, why are we still talking about Rwanda now? Because you and I are
Yeah.
immersed in this, but most people really have no idea what's happened in Rwanda since 94. Maybe if you can do the 3 or 4 minute version as opposed to the 5 week version for this one.
That's right. I was going to say, how much time do we have?
Mm,
Um, there are a lot of reasons why we're still talking about Rwanda now. But one is that what the world is supposed to have learned from one of the most horrific human atrocity was not learned. And to this day, we still have atrocities that are being committed. And this is even more important to the people in the US because the US is one of the donor nations to
mhm,
Rwanda. So our own tax dollars are financing a dictatorial regime that is not only repressing its own people inside of the country, but also exporting violence outside of the country. We talked about the kidnapping of Paul Rusesabagina. You talked about it in the introduction. Um, Thousands of people have been kidnapped inside and outside of Rwanda. Um, Millions of people have been killed or unalived, as as the new lingo, goes. And we are footing the bill as American citizens, tax-paying citizens, because not only is the U.S. a donor nation, the U.S. has provided uh, diplomatic and political protection to the regime, and also provides military support, including training. That also is not confined to just the U.S. Joel talked about it. Much of um, the Democratic West in North America. Canada's involved.
mm,
The European Union is involved. The UK has been one of the biggest staunch supporters. There is always a project on Rwanda that
mm,
cannot that just will not go away. It won't stop us talking about it. If I'll just go to another example, besides our own tax dollars sponsoring a regime that mass murders and kidnaps and is involved in just horrific, horrible atrocities. Um, there's also um, the hypocrisy of the democratic West, where today or 2 years ago, we saw what the reaction was to the invasion of Ukraine, the uh, the invasion of space, of a sovereign space, and the move to isolate Vladimir Putin and Russia, and the sanctions and so many measures that were taken, both political, corporate, and private citizens. During the same exact year, for the umpteenth time, Rwanda invaded Congo. Basically, did the same thing that Russia did, and nobody batted an eye. In fact, at the end of that year, um, uh, the European Union gave a large sum of money. I believe it was $20 million of military support, while on one hand condemning the atrocities in the Congo, and at the same time sponsoring and providing military support to the regime that is committing those atrocities. And so we are directly uh, participating in a way, indirectly participating, but directly affected because every time you go to work and money comes out of your check, a part of it goes to these atrocities. That's one of the easiest and quickest ways to connect that what's going on.
And that's a very good connection. Thank you. Let's break this up a little bit, maybe. And you've talked about internal human rights violations and atrocities and external. Maybe we can focus on the internal a little
Yeah.
bit first and the problems for people inside of the country. One of the things that we both know is Rwanda is known as a country, and President Kagame, a leader who tolerates no dissent, and they might be the strongest country in the world in terms of stopping all dissent. Can you talk about what that's like, and maybe even put it in terms of there was an election there back in July where President Kagame got a record 99% of the vote. That really the only question was, what would he say the vote count was at the end of the election?
Right.
But this is a one-man rule with no dissent. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like for people inside Rwanda, but also critics outside of Rwanda, like yourself, like me, like Paul Rusesabagina, and many others?
Yes, I think I'm glad you brought it in the end to the outside also, because what happens inside is not actually isolated. It also happens on the outside. But what we have in Rwanda, um, we have so one of the things you just mentioned was an election, a so-called election, a pretend election, where basically Kagame, the president of Rwanda, assigned himself 99% of the vote. He keeps going up. The next election,
It
he'll
does.
probably get 103 out of
Yeah.
100.
That's what I was thinking.
The,
Yeah.
the way it's
A
going.
dictator is he? He didn't exceed 100%.
Right, right. At one point, at one point he had 93%. The next one
Yeah.
he had 95. The next time he had 97. Now he's 99 point something. So I'm expecting, the next time he organizes an election that he will assign himself over 100%. So that's one.
Now,
The
Claude, by the way, it's illegal for us to say the people don't love him. So are you saying the people don't love him?
I know 100% the people do not love him. In fact, when they held an election, dared to allow people to actually cast ballots, they ended up, of course, destroying those ballots. And we have testimony, we have evidence, we have people who participated in destroying the ballots. He lost to the former Prime Minister, Faustin Twagiramungu, who has since passed. He passed last year. Um, so um, people don't love somebody that brutalizes them. Now I'm getting to the internal. And this isn't just about dissent. And I'll start with an example close to me. People my generation, people born between the year 1980, 1990, 1979, 1980 to 2007, there is a study that showed that there is um, around 600,000 individuals that have gone missing and cannot be accounted for. And those are people born during that period at different times. And this happened only in the years between 2005 and 2016. That study is for just that period. So some were kids when they went missing. So again, connecting it back to the US, every single year, the State Department releases reports that talk about things like this: enforced disappearances. That is rampant. Enforced disappearances when the government takes somebody away and no one can find them. And they're not pronounced dead. No one knows what happened to them. Families keep looking for them for decades and years, and most of the time never find such people. Uh, there is serious repression against free speech. Every independent journalist um, in Rwanda has either fled, been assassinated, or is in prison, including YouTubers. Anyone that's actually come out and, you know, this was pre-podcasting, or at least pre when podcasting became popular. But anyone that came publicly and spoke has paid the price of either being jailed, definitely tortured, and in some cases killed. I'll in some cases, genocide survivors like myself who talk about the experiences of what we survived without sanitizing it, without making it fit in the official narrative crafted by the RPF in order to erase the crimes that they actually committed, also the massive crimes they committed before, during, and after the genocide. Such survivors are in prison. Survivors who refused to incriminate, to give evidence that incriminates people that the RPF, which is the party in power in Rwanda, uh, wants to incriminate, those survivors end up in jail. I have examples of people who, in the process of what the so-called reconciliation process in the trials of the traditional gacaca courts that uh, tried the suspects who or those who were involved in genocide. There were many cases where innocent people were prosecuted, and survivors were asked to go and actually uh, provide testimony and corroborate the accusations. Those survivors who refused to do that, some served years in prison. We also have some of those stories in our book, Survivors Uncensored. Some of them ended up exiled into refugee camps, so lost their families, lost their family members. They refused to speak to incriminate people who they never saw commit the crimes the government was accusing them of, and they ended up exiled because they didn't want to go to prison. One of the most, a couple of, let me, I'll also want to lift three of the most famous. I'll lift up four real quickly, quick stories. Four genocide survivors that have become famous in Rwanda. One is Dio Mushahidi. Dio Mushahidi lost his whole family in the genocide. In 2000, in the early 2000s, he revealed to a Cameroonian journalist, an investigative journalist, Charles Onana, uh, he revealed the atrocities committed by the RPF. They co-authored a book, they released that book, and years later, Deo Mushahidi traveled to the region near Rwanda. He was kidnapped, taken to Rwanda, and he's serving a life sentence in Rwanda. Charles Onana right now is under trial in France as we speak today, this week. He's under trial because one of his latest books that talks about the atrocities in Rwanda and in the Congo um, speaks about the atrocities of the RPF. So the RPF has unleashed so-called human rights organizations that actually work under the umbrella of the RPF to go after him in France. So he's undergoing trial right now. Now, Deo Mushahidi is spending life in prison. A second one is Kizito Mihigo, a famous gospel singer, also one of my generation. He lost his father in the genocide, lost many relatives in the genocide. He became really famous because of his gospel music, but also because he taught forgiveness and reconciliation. And even one day, he sang a song in 2014, 10 years ago. He sang a song that recognized and acknowledged the atrocities committed by the RPF. They arrested him, they tortured him, they disappeared him for a while. They eventually brought him forward into the public, handcuffed in front of microphones and cameras, just like we saw with Paul Rusesabagina 4 years ago, and paraded him in front of the journalist. They tortured him into admitting uh, that he was plotting against the president. They sentenced him to 10 years. Um, he went to prison, and while he was in prison, he released audios, uh, secret audios of the torture that he was undergoing.
Hmm.
Uh, During his imprisonment, at some point, Paul Kagame decided to pardon him and released him. He was out of prison for 2 years. He was in prison for 4 years. He was out of prison for 2 years, and he tried to escape Rwanda in 2020. In February 2020, they arrested him before he crossed the border. So he hadn't done anything. He was still inside of Rwanda, which he should legally be allowed to be. They took him from there. They arrested him, and 3 days later, he was pronounced dead. Two more quick ones. Aimable Karasira was a university professor. Um, he's he survived the genocide in 1994, along with most of his immediate family. He had lost one brother to a bombing, and after the genocide, after the RPF took over, his mother went to work in a place with his sister. They went missing. When their father went to go look for went to go look for their mother, his father never came back either. Imable Karasira went to look for his father and his mother and his sister. When he got there, somebody said, "This place that you're coming to, you're not gonna make it out of here. Get out of here." And he got away. Years later, in 2019, 2020, he started talking about his experiences and things like that. He's been arrested. He was arrested in 2021. He was doing this on YouTube. First, they fired him from his university job. He's also a musician, so he's sang a lot of songs that are very popular. And he's a very engaging and entertaining person, even just to listen to him, and a great storyteller. When he was arrested in May of 2021, they accused him uh, of genocide revisionism, the same genocide that he actually survived. Um, he's been in prison in pre-trial detention for 3.5 years as we speak today. He has not had a full trial. He's still in prison today. He's been tortured. He gets all of these folks are getting tortured. And the last one is a woman who came out in February 2021. She only lasted 15 days on YouTube, and they arrested her for genocide ideology. She's a survivor of the genocide also, Yvonne Idamange. But she was very critical of the Kagame regime. And so that is what happens. I'm using these examples because these are famous examples.
Yeah.
For journalists, such as there is a famous one that used to just give microphones to the people to just talk about what was happening to them, the hardships of life. He also was arrested. This is Kuma Hassan. He was arrested in 2021. The woman was sentenced to 15 years, by the way. So she did have a trial, 15 years for just speaking publicly. This guy, for giving a microphone to the public, he's been sentenced to 9 years, and many journalists are today, in prison. There is a bunch of people who were arrested in 2021 for reading a book about how to overthrow a dictatorship. Uh, so there's a lot of things like that going on in Rwanda, but it's not just to the people that are outspoken, it's to the street vendors. Every time somebody talks to me about Rwanda and they're like, it's a very clean country, I always ask them, did you see any street vendors in Kigali? And they say no. I was like, well, how many cities have you been to? And they tell me how many. I was like, how many did not have street vendors? Tell me one. What other city in the world have you been to that has no street vendors? And then they start, thinking, oh, I never thought about that. So
What are the
that's
reasons for that, Claude?
to keep it clean for the outsiders, for the privilege of
Hmm.
those who come from the outside to see it as clean, to feel safe, and to come out praising the dictatorship and saying this is one of the most efficient countries, it's one of the cleanest. And so when people experience privilege, they are blinded to the plight and the suffering of the local people. It's like, going to a place in, they say you just go to some place in Canada or Mexico for
And
vacation.
real quick, that the four uh, examples you gave of people who have been detained, um, it sounded like most of them were, in one way or another, critical not just of Kagame's rule, but about RPF atrocities dating back to the genocide. Is that correct? And is that still like the majority of sort of the crackdowns? Is that, or is it like, how does one run afoul? How does someone inside of Rwanda run afoul of the regime to the point where they tend to get arrested? Is it just any criticism at all, or is it primarily about the genocide?
No, it is any criticism. The genocide is just used as a catch-all way to criminalize people.
I
It's a
got it.
blackmail. Yeah, it's a blackmail that's used not only in the country but also outside of the country.
So if you
It's
criticize the Kagame regime, then you're a genocidaire or something, right? Or,
pretty
or a
much,
denier.
pretty
Yeah.
much. I
Yeah,
mean, if you talk about a
I love
pothole,
I love the
go
phrases,
ahead, Brad.
Claude. You use some of them. The official
Yeah.
narrative is all Hutus bad and killers, all Tutsis
Uh-huh.
good and heroes. But the Constitution actually has some of the words you use. Genocide ideology is a crime,
Yeah.
and anything that Kagame says is genocide ideology is genocide
Is
ideology.
genocide ideology. Yeah.
Genocide
Yeah.
negationism, genocide revisionism, double genocide theory. All of these things are the crimes that people are charged with, even if they had nothing to do with it at all. And
But the
even if they
things they may actually have done is like littering or something, right? Is that like, is it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
In many cases, you can say anything or do anything, they'll just find a way to tie you to the
Got it.
genocide.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's generally how they do it. And in some cases, or in many cases, in fact, you could criticize the Kagame government for what they're like. The conversation we're having right now,
Hmm.
we're mostly not talking about the genocide. We're just talking about things that are happening in the country. We would be accused of having genocide ideology, denying genocide. I mean,
Well,
any
Brian already said
case.
he teaches genocide. Oh, wait, he says I do too.
I went to speak up at a place one time, and I get stalked a lot. Whenever events are happening
Yeah.
publicly, um, they'll show up. Kagame's followers, and especially people that are either fanatics or on the payroll. And I remember one time, somebody in the audience, one of the people who had come to defend Kagame and his regime, called me a genocide denier. And the people in the audience turned and said, well, this person just not only acknowledged the genocide, but talked about the experience surviving the genocide and talked about the genocide that was committed in neighboring Congo. If anything, you could accuse him of accepting too many genocides.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you
uh,
should be a double genocide theorist, not a genocide denier.
or a
Now,
multi-genocide. I
well,
Yeah.
mean, wherever genocide is happening, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging it. Genocide is not unique to Rwanda.
yeah.
No.
Maybe we can take this because you just mentioned you being followed, and I've had
Yeah.
that experience many times working with Paul Rusesabagina at many of his speeches and speeches that I've done myself. Members of people who represent the Rwandan government unofficially, they're usually Rwandans in the diaspora, but sometimes it's even
Mhm.
been someone comes in from the Rwandan embassy in
Yeah,
D.C. to
yeah.
these things and
Hmm.
comes to public speeches of anyone they think might might dissent from Rwanda's point of view to make sure that they bring out the other side. This is honestly the only government I've ever heard of that does this, and stalking is a good word for it. But it goes far beyond that too. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the experiences people in the diaspora have had when talking in Europe or talking in the U.S. How does the Rwandan government treat that?
Yeah, and that's why earlier I said it's really hard to confine what happens in Rwanda to just Rwanda only. It's internal, regional, and international. You're talking about getting stalked.
Hmm.
I can tell you 100% that at some of the places that I have been, it was embassy staff,
Hmm.
including ambassadors themselves. I remember speaking at the National Press Club in DC, and Ambassador Kimonyo was there. I'm mentioning his name because I can show you pictures, with him there in the audience, and he at one point was heckling one of the speakers. Um, the In New York, on multiple occasions, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs was one of the people who would come to the places that I was speaking with a crew, some people from the embassy, and the current ambassador to the U.S. I met her in 2018 in Sacramento, California, and she told me she sent a guy. Um, his name is Louis. I can't remember his last name. The guy came pretending to be Congolese to some of the events that he came to. But when she mentioned the name, I went and looked up the name, and there was the guy's pictures. Um, and so this is government orchestrated. The other thing, when you mentioned that is the diaspora, the Rwanda people in the Rwandan diaspora that do this. Rwanda has a way that is organized both inside of the country but outside of the country. I want to talk about how it's organized outside of the country. Um, there are organizations that are supposed to be non-government uh, organizations. There is an association called Ibuka for survivors of genocide. That one is pretty much a branch of the government that goes out and is the leading organization in terms of going harassing people in the diaspora, bringing about court cases against the people in the diaspora, including Paul Sesawagina, including myself, the harassment on both online and in person. Um, and it's also used that some of their members have come in the same way that Paul Rusesabagina was lured to Rwanda. They also do the luring. These are a little bit less official. There is another branch of the government of Rwanda called the Rwanda. It's known as the Rwanda diaspora. In within, it's that's how they refer to them. However, it's called Rwanda. Usually they present themselves as the Rwandan community of Chicago, Rwandan community of New York, Rwandan community of Atlanta, Rwandan community of Canada, Rwandan community of whatever location. These communities are not communities of just regular people. They are of regular people, but they're organized by the government. It's a branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Rwanda's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has multiple departments, including embassies. Then from the embassies, they organize these Rwanda communities abroad. These Rwanda communities abroad are usually, if it's not embassy staff, that's who you usually see organizing and showing up at events to harass those of us in the diaspora who speak out. Those of you who are not even Rwandans who are out speaking about Rwanda, um, they are the ones who will make threats. um, they're the ones who will do the dirty work because again they don't have official titles from the embassy or from the ministry, but the embassy organizes them. The embassies also collect money from them, membership And what they do is by being a part of that, you get privileges whenever you go to Rwanda. They give out a card. You know, Rwandans are they're obsessed
Hmm.
with issuing
Yeah,
cards.
yeah,
You would
So
think
they
people would learn.
right?
yeah.
They have these IDs, these ways of identifying people. So they give them cards, and when you go there, you present that card. You go in front of every line that you go to. If you're needing paperwork, whatever you're needing, any kind of official documentation, purchasing land or investing and things like that, you get privileged treatment. So the harassment itself comes in many forms. In some cases, they will do everything to have you canceled. And we had a little bit of that last year, Brian, when I spoke at Loyola University, where they were calling for having me canceled. That wasn't the only time. That wasn't unique. Not to make Loyola feel special at
Literally,
all.
just to be specific here, and I've seen this dozens of times for myself and for Paul too. They call when you're at a university, they will call the office of the university president and say
Hmm.
this person is a genocide denier or whatever, and you can't allow them to speak. And it's
Hmm.
just incredible. But that this is a regular practice. Then it comes out
Yeah.
of the embassy in the U.S. It comes out of the embassy in Washington when they make those calls.
I have letters. I've seen letters written to university deans and heads of departments in the various places that I've gone and spoken. So those are the various forms. Now, the worst one is the violence, especially when you
Yeah.
go to countries where it's not as secure. The attempted kidnappings, which I've experienced. And then many people, I have been fortunate enough to not um, ever get captured. You know, Paul is the most famous case. Paul Rusesabagina is the most famous case of such kidnappings and abductions. But there are dozens and hundreds of cases of people who have been kidnapped from a variety of countries and taken back to Rwanda. And in some cases, they come up missing and never show up. In some cases, they parade them in front of the media. And what the reason they do that, and this is something that we get all the time. I don't know if you hear this, Brian. If they ever come at you and say, "We will get every single one of you," that is the reason why they parade people in front of the cameras, in front of the media, is to say nobody can escape, nobody can get away. You can't talk, you cannot criticize the RPF and Kagame and government policies and get away.
Absolutely. Well, also, it's not just kidnappings; it's killings and attempted killings, assassinations.
Yeah.
The highest profile one was they assassinated the former Rwandan intelligence chief who fled the
Mhm.
country, and he was
Yeah,
assassinated in South Africa. So there've been
that's right.
assassinations in Europe and attempts in Britain. So it's terrible. Two quick things
Yes.
on this, Claude. One, just to clarify, so everyone knows, there are almost 2 million Rwandans in the diaspora, most of whom are exiles who feel they can't go back. You're
Hmm.
talking about a group that are Rwandans that are here with the permission and blessing of the Rwandan government, going about everyday life and everyday business. But most Rwandans in exile aren't part of that community, and
Hmm.
are often seen as opponents of the government. The other thing I just want to
Yeah,
add
do you have
on to the
percentages of those, Brian or Claude? Like, what's the balance there in numbers? I mean, obviously, there's way more exiles, but
it's a very
Yeah.
small number of people who are here just as Rwandan immigrants who
okay,
are legal
Yeah.
immigrants, just coming over on their own free will.
uh huh,
Most of the Rwandans outside are in exile. The other thing I want to mention is their social media efforts and the social media trolls
yeah,
are
yeah,
just amazing.
Hmm.
Kagame has several groups in his office that do nothing but social media,
Hmm.
especially on Twitter X, but on any social media you're on, you say something negative, like our YouTube page will probably be filled up now with
Yeah.
comments from the trolls, because their job is to find any mention of Rwanda or Kagame or anything else. And if it's critical, they jump in. I think my favorite, Claude, I don't know if you've ever had one of these. I had a troll, this was a bunch of years ago. We were fighting online about something, and I'd love to engage with And at one point, I said something that just kind of ended the conversation. And his response was, "Ah, Professor Endless, your name is well known in Kigali." It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that was a
Right.
threat.
They're
And then
threatening you.
there was one other that was great. He literally came in and said, "You can't believe anything this man says. He hasn't even been to Rwanda because I'd be killed if I went. He knows nothing about Rwanda." And then the troll went on, and this is on Twitter. If people want to look up my name in Rwanda on Twitter. Went on for about 30 pages of all the things I'd done wrong after saying that I knew nothing. It's like, these were all my
Right.
flaws going through.
Right. Right.
I
Right.
know you've experienced a lot of that too.
Yeah, and the hypocrisy of it to say you know nothing about Rwanda because you've never been to Rwanda, and then they talk about your work at Loyola or in Chicago. It's like, well, you've never been to Chicago, so so why are
Yeah,
you talking about it now? You know, what is your point?
yeah.
I think in addition to what you're saying about the social media, the part that I also want to talk about that's both internal and external is the surveillance, both human. So those organizations, the RCAs, the Rwanda Community Abroad, or the diaspora, organized out of the Rwandan embassies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, does the surveilling of and the stalking of pretty much anybody that is speaking about Rwanda, doing anything about Rwanda. Um, and then inside of the country, they have a system that basically tracks every 10 houses. If you go and visit somebody in Kigali, they will know that you spent the night or not. But they also use technology, and they've used in recent years Pegasus in 2019 and
Mm.
also in 2021. The Pegasus spyware that basically infects your devices, take can get into the camera and the microphone and actually get into things that you write. This was used on um, activists, politicians, foreign officials, journalists. There were 3,500 people in 2022, 2021 that were impacted by the Pegasus surveillance spyware. They also use other things, but technology is definitely a big thing. So the online trolls are, in addition to the surveillance, to the intrusions, the and of course it's like an army of trolls. We have people in our book that talk about being a part of that because one of the things that we have in the book is that many people are exiled Rwandans, but there are people who are still in Rwanda who also contributed stories. A lot
Uh-huh.
of the younger people talked about being recruited into those activities and being part of these online troll armies that come out and harass and threaten. Your name is well known in Kigali. Okay, big deal.
The ultimate
But
threat from the dictatorship.
Yeah.
right, right, right.
Um,
Um,
no,
one
I
one
mean,
other thing. One other thing is in multiple countries around the world, Rwandan diplomats have been expelled for because of surveillance or violence inside of those countries. Um, Here in the U.S., at one point there was one of the and I'm forgetting his name. I believe it was Jean Bosco Kazura, one of the highest-ranking military uh, officials in Rwanda, who was in Rwanda in some capacity as as a diplomat who was expelled years ago. In Norway, a diplomat was at least one was or Sweden. One of the I believe it's either Norway or Sweden. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not 100% precise on which one of the two countries for surveillance on exiled Rwandans in Sweden. In Kenya, there were multiple assassinations where diplomats were caught with smoking guns, literally hot guns, at the crime scene. In South Africa, Brian talked about the former chief of intelligence, Patrick Karegeya, After his assassination, there was a whole trial, and it um, went up. I mean, South Africa expelled Rwandan diplomats. Rwandan diplomats were Rwanda in turn also expelled South African diplomats. Rwandan diplomats have been blocked from taking on their duties in various countries, including uh, Congo, including Belgium, and one of the things when we talk about that violence, Brian, that I also wanted to talk about, you talk about assassinations, we're talking individuals. There's also whole massacres of just historical proportion where the worst case of exported violence against a country, Rwanda has committed against its own citizens, has been in the Congo, where Rwanda went into refugee camps, and these are massive, sprawling
Yeah.
tent cities, and they just started from one. They surrounded them and they shot indiscriminately, and then in some cases they would just, surround the people, take them to certain places where they would massacre all of them. In the space of 2 years, more than 200,000 Rwandan refugees in the Congo were unaccounted for after that invasion of the Congo. So it's the regime itself. You, the thing that I always say whenever I meet people, especially in the U.S. or in Europe, that praise the Kagame regime and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, I tell them you would not want your children to live under such
Yeah.
a system. And so do not think that it is okay for Rwandans to live under a system like that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Maybe we've just got about 5 minutes left. You moved us over to the Congo, and maybe we can finish off there. So this is something that's been going on since 1998, really even 1996, with Rwandan forces helping to change the government there. And then there's been an ongoing, what's often called a rebel conflict, but it's not really rebels since that point in time. Now it's Rwanda sponsoring the M23 quote unquote rebel group, but also Rwandan military just being inside of the Congo next door. And it's really all a conflict over conflict minerals, over coltan, and more recently over gold, too. Can you give us just some of the high level issues with the massive numbers of people killed and rapes and the world choosing not to do anything about it?
Yeah, the
And if you can
Congo.
add to that also, like what's Rwanda, what's Kagame's end game there? Like, is it about seizing territory and expanding Rwanda's borders, or what are they? What realistically are they trying to achieve? Because I've been interested in that question.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good place to start. What Because it goes right into the question that Brian is asking. Um, you know, Congo's been invaded by both Rwanda and Uganda, and Uganda was the country where Rwanda was invaded from in 1990. The war that
Mm-hmm.
led to the genocide, and then in '96 they teamed up and invaded Congo, and they were part of all of these atrocities. Um, but then the Kagame's endgame is initially, I believe, he believed that he could take up some territory and control uh, parts of Congo. He definitely wants to influence the Congo. That's the personal part of it. But also, Kagame he's a local mercenary for multinationals that are exploiting the Congolese. So he's making money
Mm-hmm.
and enriching himself and his officers as a part of the plunder of the Congo. There are many, there are hundreds of multinationals, mostly from the Democratic West, many of them on the Toronto stock market. When we speak about these things, and we tend to criticize the US very heavily, and other countries, and forget about Canada. But I don't know if it's very heavily is the word, but we criticize the US and we forget about Canada. Canadian companies are some of they make up one of the largest number of companies that are actually in the Congo exploiting the minerals in the Congo. And obviously, it takes displacement of the people from those places. And Kagame serves that purpose, and
Huh.
Museveni serves that purpose. Um, Now, the invasion itself has been what Congo has experienced. I always say is the deadliest, most underreported um, human atrocity that I have seen and heard of, and it's the deadliest conflict since World War II.
Mhm.
But we don't hear about it much again because it incriminates so many people around the world, including Paul Kagame, who is a darling of many Western countries. But the minerals are at the heart of it. It's the access to the wealth of the Congo that is driving the conflict. And then Kagame's ambition to control it, or that's his own personal ambition. The cost has been more than 6 million innocent lives have perished as a result of this invasion, and more than half of these have been children under the age of 5. And so we're talking about babies, toddlers and babies, basically that have suffered the most in this conflict. Hundreds of thousands of women have been raped. One of the worst things that I hear is that Congo is the rape capital of the world because rape is used as a weapon of war. Um, the the way that this has happened, so you talked about the M23 rebels, it always starts with there's a way that they disguise these countries' involvement, Rwanda and Uganda's involvement in the Congo. And it's basically, you put on a face, you put on a facade that says we are a rebel group, but it's really an official military. What I always say is, where in Africa have you ever seen a rebel group where everybody has uniforms and
Right. Yeah.
ticketed equipment? Nobody is wearing a Michael Jordan jersey. Nobody's
Yeah.
wearing flip-flops. I mean, the hats match, the shoes match, all of that. That is an official military. And in recent years, I've seen complaints from the M23 saying, "Oh, we're not involved in this. They're not involving us in the peace talks." And I always say, no, the leader of the M23 is involved, Paul Kagame. You
Yeah.
know, they're represented. And anytime there are losses, military losses by the M23, the largest complaints, the loudest complaints come from Rwanda.
Yeah,
And why is that? If you're
absolutely.
not part of that rebel group, if you don't sponsor them, if you're not involved with them, then why are you crying when they have losses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Can I
and
ask
this
one
is a
more question to
go
wrap
ahead,
us up? Because
please.
I think you'll like this. So I'm teaching a course on dictatorship this semester, and as you were talking before about um, both Kagame and the RPF, I'd never again what I know about the RPF was as the fighting force that came in and ultimately ended the genocide. But it sounds like it is also Kagame has somewhat transformed it into a ruling party. My question, though, is Kagame is going to be gone someday, right? Time always wins. Um,
Mhm.
is is the RPF like when he goes? Is that the end of the RPF as a ruling entity as well, or is it constituted itself in a way that that it can replace the dictator with another dictator. And one thing
Yeah,
that struck me in this course is these kinds of regimes vary mightily on that score, and some are able to last beyond the creator, and some are not. I'm kind of curious how what do you see? How
And,
entrenched is the RPF as an organization there in
and
terms
Claude,
of
this one is good because I don't know if you and I agree here or not. So let's see where you're at, and
good?
let's see where I'm at on this one.
I'll know Claude
yeah.
is right then.
Well, I think on one hand, Kagame being gone, and as you said, you're right, Father Time is undefeated. eventually he'll be gone. Kagame means a lot to the RPF because there's so much built around him. I mean, you don't really hear about the RPF, you hear about Kagame.
Okay.
He's the one that's invited to Davos. He's the one that's speaking at the Clinton Global Initiative. He's the one that's friends with Tony Blair and all the kingmakers. And so he he holds a lot for the RPF. I do see the RPF as an entrenched system in the country that it's gonna take at the end of the day, Rwanda has to have a revolution. Rwandans have to revolt inside of the country to have real lasting change. And part of the revolting starts with actually speaking, being able to, speaking freely and accepting the consequences, which are terrible consequences. That truth leading to eventually justice is what's going to set the foundation for lasting peace in Rwanda, which is also, to me, the formula for the region, including the Congo. But when it comes to the RPF, I think that it's going to lose at least a good 60-70% of its power by losing Paul Kagame because he is the ultimate diplomat for the
Mm,
uh, for the RPF.
got it.
Sadly, Claude, I agree, but I'm going to go a little further. I think his one man rule is so entrenched that there's almost definitely going to be violence afterwards, and I think that's the worst possible results that we could see here. But I'm not sure who else would to go in. There's just no structure to replace him. He
But
is.
if there's going to be violence, isn't the RPF best place to then hold on to control? If you're sort of seeing a certainty of violence, they
They may
certainly
they may
have their
Well,
break up
position.
into violence.
Well,
Yeah.
I think to say that there's going to be violence after is, I'm not sure that I agree with that. With that also, I agree that there will be violence, but there's already violence. Rwanda is
Well,
a violent place,
You're right.
fair,
and
Yeah.
people are suffering. And not only are they violent inside of Rwanda, they're
yeah,
violent and belligerent in the region and violent
that's the
all
episode.
across the globe. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, I mean, the violence at the end is the end
Yep.
of
yeah.
Yeah.
hopefully of violence, but yeah, it's just
Jo-
they are very good at
Joel,
hiding it and concealing it.
Joel
Hmm.
always likes to ask the what if question that to set us off at the, at the
Joe
end.
taught me that. Thank you, Joe Esposito.
Yeah,
All right. Well,
I
Claude,
think that
this has
question
been
made all of us jump out of our chairs.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
This has been excellent, Claude. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for joining us. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to plug Survivors Uncensored one more time. People should go out and look it up. Fantastic stories from many survivors. Thank you for all the work you're doing and for keeping it alive. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you both for the work that you do. Thank you, Brian, for the work you do, not only as a professor but also in Rwanda. And thank you, Joel, for teaching about genocide. And definitely hope to see many of the survivors and Survivors Uncensored contributing to some of your teachings.
Thank you
Great.
so much.
Fantastic. Yep.
Uh,
So thank you all. Joel, thanks. Andy, our producer, thank you very much. Thanks to those of you who joined us. Please spread the word. Let us know if you have any topics you want us to cover. And we will see you next time. Have a good one.